For many years at LSNJ, child welfare has been an area where we've provided assistance and advocacy and leadership for many years, particularly through our Family Representation Project, which is led by none other than Jey Rajaraman, who you'll hear from shortly. She and the esteemed panelists will talk about the important work being done to prevent the unnecessary removal of children from their families, and more specifically today, supporting parents with substance abuse disorders. Also lifting up the urgent need to reframe the way we look at the system and the damage which can be caused by removals, and the unfortunate reality that frequently those families are families who are in poverty and families of color. The speakers today have a great wealth of knowledge and various perspectives on the issues that we are going to talk about today, and we're very grateful to have them all with us. And finally, just a plug for our next Justice Series event in September. I hope you can join us for that as well. We'll be bringing in some wonderful outside speakers to discuss a topic which it is overdue, time to reinvigorate and re-explore making a case for reparations for Black Americans. So we'll talk about what's happening on the other side of the country, the other coast, and the potential for reparations right here in New Jersey. So stay tuned for that. A formal announcement is coming. But today, back to our program. And without further ado, I'm proud to turn it over to Jey and his esteemed panelists, substance use in the child welfare system. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Rachel and Akil. As I start presenting and talking about today's program, I'm going to share my screen, which always takes a second. Okay. And so as described, first, my name is Jey Rajaraman, and welcome to the many attendees, and many of you I know. I'm really thrilled that you're all here. I'm beyond honored and thrilled to have these panelists with me today, Professor Stephens, Elizabeth Brico, and New Jersey's own parent ally, Alexandra Travis. And today we're talking about substance use in the child welfare system, and really, more importantly, how to change the way we think about substance use and how this current system really destroys families who struggle or decide to use substances. So we're taking this issue head on, but through the lens of a conversation to hear directly from people who have experienced the system itself, from Elizabeth and Alexandra, and also from Professor Stephens in her experience, not only teaching and studying and researching, and her dedication to families involved in the system, on her perspective through the social worker science lens of how this actually affects families. So there's been such incredible programs out there on racism in the child welfare system, poverty in the child welfare system, very data-driven, and information about how families are being affected. And we will hit on that, but what we really wanted to do is make sure you hear from two voices that have experienced it and what they've observed. So really from the inside out versus outside in, community parent voiced driven presentation, and not hearing from, honestly, that academic perspective, which is available out there. But so we hope to sort of challenge the way we think about substance use in the system. Okay. So just wanted to read this quote that I thought was pretty moving and just set the mind space today. By Brene Brown, which I think she's been quoted quite a bit recently and lately through different venues. But if we share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. Shame needs three things to grow exponentially in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment. It cannot survive being spoken. It cannot survive empathy. I say this because I think, and I know when representing serving families that we do and parents in the system, the concept of substance use is that this parent is abusive and neglectful and dangerous to their child, right? That's the story, that's the belief, that's why children are taken from their families. And I just want to name it, I want to call it out early. in the beginning of this presentation to challenge that we should actually think of these families differently and have it through the lens of empathy and think of these families in a more humanized way. So with me, I have Professor Stephens, and I'm actually going to read their bios at the end because I actually really want to get to their presentations, and all of them actually said to me they'd rather just speak, but they're really critically acclaimed. So I thought it would be more useful to hear from them during the presentation, then hear about their credentials at the end. And I know they would support that because I know they want to speak. But I just wanted to set also kind of the setting, just a few slides to kind of guide the conversation, is that we know that poverty and neighborhood disadvantage are the most consistent and strongest predictors of child welfare involvement. So again, that we know that the families involved in New Jersey, and this is across the nation, live in poverty. And that is the highest indicator of their involvement. We also know that most referrals, these are national statistics from the Children's Bureau, that there's 3 million reports each year. 75% are identified for neglect. 1 out of 3 children will be subject to an investigation. 50% of children will be subject to Black children will be subject to an investigation. And 83% of all these reports are unsubstantiated. Again, we're trying to spend time here on substance use, but I want you to think of the context and the realities for these families, that they're living in poverty, that it's impoverished children that are being identified and involved in the system. And we also see that Black and brown families are much more likely to face an investigation, face the trauma and investigation, be taken from their parents, remain in the system longer. And then when you unpack that further, you learn and realize that the allegations and the concerns involved with these families are identified as neglect. And further unpacking that, they result in unsubstantiated, meaning that there is no finding of abuse or neglect or harm to these children. Okay. Also, then part of substance use conversation that we'll be listening to today is that the professionals, and here is a quote by Kelly Fong, who's been recently reporting on these issues for the imprint, the Columbia Journal. She's done great deals of presentations. And she was quoted recently saying, reporting professionals who are encountered facing adversities such as poverty, domestic violence, and substance abuse frame parents not as unequivocally dangerous, but as needing additional intervention to care for their children effectively. Reports came from constrained street-level bureaucrats hoping to rehabilitate families in need by shuttling them to a multifaceted surveillance agency. So her point being that many of these reporters are not calling the agency because there's a concern for abuse and that these children are actually being harmed, but they're looking to see if there's services available to them. And then what occurs is that they become part of the system and feel like they're being surveilled, they're being structured into a system that fails the actual needs that were of concern from the reporters in the first place. Okay. As we noted about poverty, I also wanted to note again and stress and emphasize that while Black children only comprise 13.9% of the total child population, they represent 23% of the population of children entering foster care. In contrast, white children represent 66.7% of the total child population, yet they only make 44% of children in foster care. So there's a clear overrepresentation of Black children in the foster care system. And since we are presenting New Jersey, I did want to highlight the statistics here. Similar to the national data where Black children make up where Black children comprise 18.3% of the total child population in New Jersey, they represent 41.2% of the population in children in foster care. So with that framing, again, understanding that the families involved in the system are impoverished. If they are Black or brown background, they're more likely to enter a system, be questioned by the system, and remain in the system. And now we're going to sort of look at the lens of substance use and what that means for these children and families once they enter the system. So at this point, I'll reach out to my colleague and good friend, Professor Stephens, and I just will drop in the chat some of her recent presentations and talks because just they're exceptional and so moving. And she's connected to some of the great work of Dorothy Roberts, who's a hero to many of us on this panel. And so I want you to see their messaging so you can see greater speeches and presentations. But at this point, I will hand it over to my friend, Professor Stephens.
I apologize if I could just break in and give the first CLE code word and also ask a question. There was a question about whether the slides are going to be available online. Jey, are you planning to post the slides?
Yes, we will provide the slides. Are more of a guide for me to stay focused. I know my LSNJ family knows I need that. But yes, for the data and the links to APCARS and Children's Bureau will be linked along with the links that I'll be dropping in the chat now. So you have access to recent presentations about racism and poverty in the child welfare system.
Thank you. And so our first CLE word for those of you who are seeking New Jersey CLE is Starbucks. STARBUCKS. And out of homage to Jey, the training assistant Kelly, our training assistant Kelly Rivera, decided to make Starbucks the first code word of the day. Starbucks.
All right. Thank you, Jey, for that wonderful introduction. And it's definitely a pleasure to be on with Alexandra and Elizabeth on this panel. And so I'm going to invite you to put aside what you were taught the first time you heard about substances for this particular talk. And I'm going to invite you to think about substances from a very humanistic lens. So substances are actually, human beings are actually hardwired to respond to substances.
My apologies, Professor Stephens. I'm so sorry. Is there any way, can you speak a little bit louder? There are several people that are having a hard time hearing you.
Not a problem. How is this?
That's better. Thank you.
If it doesn't sound, I am yelling at you, but I'm not yelling at you, okay? So let me reset that. So I'm going to invite you to think about substances in a very different way than you were probably introduced to the idea of substances. There's a part of the human brain, it's called the reward system, that's actually hardwired towards pleasure. And so from the very first time that a human being picked up a coca leaf and chewed it, or picked up a mushroom in a forest and ate it, or I always like to think of that first human being who braved whatever it looked like when alcohol, which had been sitting there for quite some time, who braved that first drink, drank it. There's a part of the human brain that lit up. It's the part of the brain, the very human part of us, that responds to pleasure. That is the part of the brain that responds to substances. I want to invite you to understand that there is nothing inherently wrong with substances. Very different from perhaps what many people have been taught, right? I'm seeing here is still coming through. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? How is that? Is that better? Okay, I think there's, my headphones weren't working. There's something going on. Excellent, wonderful. So there's nothing inherently wrong with substances. I want you to open up that space of thinking about substances across the continuum of use. Now, if you were in a classroom with me, I would ask how many people use substances this morning? And people would then really appropriate to what Jey was talking about, like with the concepts of shame and hiding would probably go like this. And then I would raise my hand and I would say, I had a cup of coffee this morning. And we even said Starbucks, and Starbucks sells some of the most caffeinated coffee in the whole country. Now, when I say, did you have a cup of coffee this morning? A lot of people's hands would shoot up because the shame was gone, right? But caffeine is a stimulant. It's a drug, it's a substance. But some drugs are designated as shameful versus others not being shameful. They're regulated differently, right? So I want to invite you again to think about the continuum of use that is possible for human beings with substances. So we can have anything from recreational, one-time, minimal use, all the way through occasional use, through moderated use, through dependence, all the way into addiction. There's a spectrum of use that is possible for human beings with substances that does not indicate that they are out of control of their lives. I want you to breathe that in, because that's not what we were taught. Just say no to drugs does not introduce you to the range of possibilities of human interaction with substances. Okay? So again, I'm going to invite you into the humanistic approach, that substance use is not inherently bad, and that substance use does not predict failure to function as a direct correlation. How are you doing? Are you with me so far? I can see some tiles, so I want to make sure we're good. Awesome. All right. But that's not what we think of when we think of child welfare, right? When we hear substance use and we hear child welfare, we immediately think of a terrible parent. And that's because substance use has been correlated with someone being a terrible and ineffective parent in the child welfare system, right? And so substance use is one of the top 3 reasons why child welfare becomes involved in a family's life. But I think there are many of you who have worked with parents, and many parents who've experienced this, where the reason that they came to the attention of child welfare was not substance use, but substance use somehow came into the conversation, right? A random drug test, or somehow a battery of tests was administered once you became child welfare involved, and your substance use then gets added on to whatever reason you were brought to the attention of child welfare. And so we look at substance use going from this very humanistic approach, very, in some ways, normalized understanding, to this vilification of parents. And so we go back a little bit in history to understand where that began. And I think many of us are very familiar with the parents who became involved with the child welfare system in the 1980s, and the specter of the crack addicted mothers and literally called crack babies of the 1980s. The media augmented that message. There was a horrendous crisis at hand. And the solution that was proposed was that these babies be taken away from their mothers. What resulted from this humanistic interaction between a human body and a substance, and a reward system that was geared towards that particular substance, was harsh punishment, recrimination, incarceration for most mothers, and almost routine child welfare involvement and separation from children. That is the specter that is still connected to the term substance use, regardless of what level of substance use, whether or not a parent is still effectively parenting their children or their child while using substances. The specter that is called on is one of an ineffective parent, and very specifically an ineffective parent who doesn't care enough about their children to stop. And that is the message that is routinely sent. One moment, I'm going on with this. But if you notice, when I talked about that humanistic approach, I didn't say to you that only child welfare involved parents use substances. There are many parents in our country that use substances that will never come to the attention of the child welfare system. And Jey, you alluded to this earlier. There are parents with privilege who will not come to the attention of the child welfare system who are parenting while using substances. There's folks with economic privilege, with racial privilege, and I would venture to say with political privilege, for whom the consequences are too great to impact their families, right? And so what you find is that the child welfare system is regulating substance use for a very specific subset of American parents, a very specific subset. Black and brown parents, Native parents, and poor families. If you are white and middle class, you are less likely to be involved with the child welfare system if you are using substances. If you are white and wealthy, you are almost never going to be involved in the child welfare system. If you are Black and wealthy, you may still come to the attention of the child welfare system, but you may have the resources to fight and make it less or a lot harder for the system to remain involved with your family. If you do not have the resources, the system enters the family and finds ways to stay in the family. And this is how substances are regulated in the child welfare system. But again, substance use is not a predictor of poor parenting. I'm going to say that again because I think we need to hear it. You can use substances and still parent your children. In New York City, in fact, substance use is not supposed to be sufficient in and of itself to remove a child, not just substances. Okay, I'm sorry, I thought you couldn't hear me again. So I stopped shouting. Using substances alone is not sufficient. It is not a direct predictor of poor parenting. And using the term substance use with its specter of ineffective parenting is not sufficient. And how do we know this to be true? We allow more resourced families the privilege of privacy to deal with substance use within their families without separation. None of the data that exists in research tells us that substance use exists only in child welfare involved families. Therefore, there is an alternative. There is an alternative. But within child welfare, and this is part of what I think has saddened me the most, with the resources available, with the money available, and there is money. Don't let anyone ever tell you there's no money in child welfare. There's enormous money in child welfare, but the vast majority of it goes to separation. It goes to housing and creating an entire system separate from a family to deal with a family that is having a struggle. Not to mention, while the rationale for separation because of substance use is the well-being of the child, we have yet to hold to account those who are not even thinking about the effect of separation on that child. I use this example, I'll use it again today. A newborn knows the smell and sound of its parent's voice. How do we quantify the decision to separate a newborn from that parent at birth because of our decision as a system, as a society, that that parent cannot be close to that child. When that parent is the only person in the world whose smell and voice it can tell from across the room. If there are other people who have grown up in that house while it was in the womb, it will recognize their voices, but not nearly as accurately as it will recognize the voice of the person that carried them for 9 months. How do we quantify that harm and say that that harm of separation is not just as harmful as any substance? By the way, the research on what crosses the blood-brain barrier for a baby is utilized in adoptions when babies who are removed are being put up for adoption to assure adoptive parents, don't worry, it's okay. This was not so harmful. But the same information will be used to separate. Jay, I was going off topic for a moment. I'm going to go back. Just as you, I need my slides. But let's say that there is a community of parents who do need more support, who have crossed into the world of addiction. And when we say crossed into the world of addiction, what I mean is where they're seeking out, using, and trying to avoid withdrawal from a drug so much that it interferes with their ability to live their lives in a meaningful way. What do we do then with all the resources we have in the United States? So as I interviewed a number of mothers in 2014 who were Black mothers, I'm going to speak louder, Benita. I interviewed a number of Black and Brown mothers in New York City in 2014. And I already mentioned or alluded to what was done with them. Separation, incarceration, harsh separation, incarceration, and child welfare involvement. And I would venture to say that as that we had an opportunity in the 80s to really build out humanistic, empathetic, and dignified services for families who had crossed into that space of addiction. We had an opportunity in the 1980s, before then, but definitely in the 80s. And we utilized those monies and time and energy to buttress a carceral system and a child welfare system that today, I don't think many people will stand in defense of unequivocally. Because what we need is empathy. What we need is dignity and an understanding that for those who have lived with addiction, that for many of those parents, addiction started early, and it started in response, oftentimes, to untreated trauma, and it was effective and useful. If you look up the film Healing Need, Dr. Anda and Tanir Kane are talking in that film. And she says it was helpful to her. She had had a really difficult childhood, and the substances helped her. And at the time they helped her, Tanir could not find mental health services that met her needs. And so it was very useful to her until she could get to better help. What if we looked at parents and said, if you are in the realm of addiction, let me meet you where you are with your child without separating you and further complicating your family's life so that you can get on the road to a stronger family. I think that is where we need to land with substance use in child welfare. What we've tried to date has not worked. It is not helpful. And if you were to go to any search engine for Google Scholar or going into NIH, you'd look at some research being done on substance use and child welfare now, And there's enormous amounts of money being geared towards looking at substance use with children in the child welfare system now. So talk about a system that is not actually doing this holistically and helping families, where monies will be geared towards that research, but not supporting a holistic family approach to getting on a better road, where there's not vilification of families for a very human condition. And so I'm going to leave it there because I want to hear, I can't wait to hear from Alexandra and Elizabeth. And I'll leave it there, calling on a system to do something in a better way for families.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Stephens. I'll take a minute to just highlight what you're doing now. You are a clinical social worker and you teach at NYU's Silver School of Social Work. You're identified nationally as a critical social worker. You have an understanding and in-depth working knowledge of mental health issues that arise from how society has suffered through poverty and racism. Your commitment to inequalities and injustice has been part of your research and studies, and you also have specialized, as we've heard just now, in women's mental health and health. And you've extended this work so naturally, so brilliantly into the child welfare system. And thank you. And you're not off the hook. We will have time for some questions and Q&A. And so, yes, please.
Jey, I need to make one clarification. I studied at NYU. I'm actually at Hunter College's Silberman School of
Sorry,
Social Work.
yes. Oh,
No
okay.
problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Google. Yes. Thank you. That's right, Hunter. And your contact information will be available also. I'm sure you may get some questions in emails, especially from the public defenders folks attending today on just how really you explain understanding use. We're next going to hear from Elizabeth Brico, who's a freelance writer who works on drug policy reform in the child welfare system, and will share her, as she feels appropriate, her own personal story and what she's done from her research, reporting, and advocacy. She's written for Vice, Filter Magazine, Columbia Journalism Review, among many others. And she's reported on our prevention work in New Jersey. And I'm proud to know her and honored to learn to be a colleague of hers, and I would like to say friend, and admire so much of her work and her advocacy. I just also want to note, I know there's a large attendee population audience here today, but this is safe space. This is where parents are sharing their vulnerable stories and electing in a way that they feel comfortable and they trust that this audience will support them and uplift them. And I ask you to do that. Feel free to celebrate them in the chat. And again, keep your hearts and ears and minds open to hear what they have to say. And we really hope this, again, we're challenging the narrative, rooting out false narratives today, as Professor Stephens described, to be open. And so I will now extend the presentation to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here today. So yeah, I am a freelance journalist and writer, and I'm also a parent who has been involved with the child welfare system. And I will say that my involvement happened in the state of Florida. And I do recognize that there are differences between states and counties when it comes to certain aspects of the way the child welfare system works. But I've also done a lot of research. I have, as Jey mentioned, reported on New Jersey, and there are also a lot of similarities. So what I plan to talk about today are aspects of my case and other cases that I've seen that I think can relate across the nation and to New Jersey, and not necessarily specific to Florida. So I just want to note that I know that sometimes people can think, especially Florida has a very bad reputation that it earned very well. But I don't want people to sit here and think, well, that happened because she was in Florida and it's not something that relates to us, because what I'm going to talk about today does relate to the state of New Jersey as well. And so what I want to focus on is, of course, the issue of substance use and the way that it is perceived and treated with parents in the child welfare system. And I really appreciate that Professor Stephens spoke so eloquently before me, because you really touched on that issue of the spectrum of use and how it's not recognized enough. That I think when a parent becomes involved in the child welfare system, if it's related to substance use or substance use comes up, the immediate assumption tends to be that it's an addiction or somehow chaotic use. And that's not necessarily true. And this is oftentimes determined through a drug test, which, drug tests a lot of times aren't even accurate in terms of even determining whether a parent used a substance at all, especially if it's not sent to a lab and if it's just an instant drug test. I've personally had an experience of having drug tests come up positive because I had a poppy seed muffin that morning, which I thought was a myth until it happened to me. And I've heard that from so many people. And they also, in addition to that, even if they are accurately assessing substance use, they're not accurately assessing anything else at all. Literally nothing else. They are not accurately assessing how much the person uses a substance, and they are not accurately assessing how much that person functions in general or how they function as a parent. And that's something that you can absolutely never determine through a drug test, ever. But those drug tests are used, and were in my case used as the means of assessing exactly that. And that's something that comes up with everyone I've ever talked to who's been child welfare involved and had substance use in their case. Those drug tests were used to determine placement. They were used to determine visitation. They were used to determine final outcomes. They should never have been used that way. We even have it in like the federal guidelines that drug tests shouldn't be used that way. Federal guidelines. Why aren't we paying attention to them? So I think that's the first thing I want to say is, or I guess really reiterate, is just that drug use, substance use, even if it is one of those substances that have been criminalized and that people tend to think of as wrong or addictive, that substance showing up on a drug test does not indicate anything except that the parent possibly ingested it at some point within the frame of that testing, and even that may not even be true depending on the substance, especially if it's an opioid or something that could have a false positive from another medication. And a lot of times those kinds of things are dismissed. Like, people just don't believe you if you say that, I ate a poppy seed muffin. We're like, you're just saying that you used opiates. Or if you're like, hey, I take this medication, that's why this is showing up for amphetamines. People are like, I don't think that's a real thing. And you have to really prove it. And sometimes you can, but it's often costly, time consuming. And in the meantime, you're treated as guilty and your visitations are cut. Or some kind of punishment is enforced until you can prove it, if you can even prove it. Especially with the opioids, it's particularly difficult because they can look at levels, but it really is an opiate positive. It's a genuine opiate positive. It just happened to be from eating something. So I'm kind of getting off topic now, I'm sorry. But I just wanted to say that first off, is that we really need to stop relying on drug tests and stop thinking of substance use in general as the be all end all of like the indication of whether a parent has worth. In my case, it really was used exactly that way. And it was used that way in an extremely harmful way, in a way that harmed my children and harmed me and harmed the entire family unit. Even the people who made the initial accusation, who were my children's paternal grandparents, have been harmed by the child welfare intervention. Whether they recognize that or not, I don't know, but I can see it. And they were harmed by the fact that child services came in, decided that I had a substance use disorder, which was technically true. It was diagnosed as in remission, but they came in, they heard an accusation, they saw I had a history, they saw I had a diagnosis, they didn't really care about the remission aspect of it, and they decided to open this case to place my children with their paternal grandparents, and then to just cause significant harm to me and their father and to my children. And one of the big ways that they caused me harm, and one of the big ways that I've seen them cause a lot of other parents harm, is that they took away my ability to deal with my substance use disorder. I did have an addiction to heroin. I did not deny that. Like, that was something that I went to treatment for. So it wasn't something I could go and say. I recognized that I was on the addiction end of the spectrum of use when it came to heroin. I don't subscribe to the belief that that means I cannot use any other substances. And in fact, when I lived in Seattle, Washington, which is where I'm originally from, I used marijuana, which was legal there, to help moderate my use of heroin, or to help abstain from heroin altogether, which is something a lot of people don't understand. In Florida, that wasn't recognized as a legitimate thing. Like, it was just seen as like a relapse or something. Like, it was like the same. Like, if you have a heroin addiction and you use marijuana, then you are relapsing, which makes no sense, because they are not the same drug. They have completely different functions. Actually, marijuana induces anxiety in me. And one of the reasons that I would use it when I had a heroin craving was to make myself too anxious to go out and get heroin. So like, this idea, I mean, that's a strange thing to do, but it worked. So this idea that I was somehow on the path to using heroin because I used marijuana legally was completely unfounded. And in Florida, it wasn't legal, and I didn't want to buy it illegally just because of my sensitivity to it and my need to like know what I'm purchasing. So I wasn't using it. And when they took my kids, they took away my ability to access Medicaid. So I no longer had the ability to go to treatment unless it was specifically prescribed by the system. I no longer had the ability to go to therapy for PTSD, which I had been doing in Seattle, unless it was prescribed by the system. So they took my children, they labeled me as having this disorder that I had, although it was in remission. And then they started accusing me of having it untreated. And the reason it was untreated was because of them, because they took away my children. And in that state, I wasn't able to get Medicaid. And then they didn't make referrals for 6 months. So I was 6 months under the devastation of having my children taken from me. I was 6 months under the stress and strain of having been made homeless because I was kicked out of my home. That was the way that my children were able to stay in kinship care, was by making me leave. And I was 6 months of just having absolutely no access to any kind of formalized care. And then I was blamed when I wasn't doing well under those conditions. So basically the system came in, they said, you have this problem, but we're not going to help you get treatment. Not only are we not going to help you get treatment for the problem you're saying you have that's so severe you can't be around your children, we're also going to actually get in the way of you getting that help. And then we're going to blame you for it. And we're going to continue to take your children from you and make things even worse for you. And this is a story I hear again and again and again and again and again with almost, I don't even want to say almost every single parent I've interviewed. I have never interviewed a parent who got a timely referral to everything they needed that was evidence-based. I have never interviewed a parent who wasn't harmed by the system. Not one. Every single parent that I talk to has a story that's unique to them, but also very similar to mine. And that's something that needs to stop happening. It's absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd to expect somebody who has a substance use disorder to do better when you traumatize them even more. It's absolutely absurd to expect someone who you are claiming has a mental health condition or a substance use disorder, you don't help them get care, or if you do, it's substandard care that doesn't meet the evidence base, and then blame them because they don't do well. That is absurd. That is absolutely absurd. And to then go and punish their children for that, punish them and punish their children, traumatize their children, put them through the foster system because you didn't do your job effectively. Why are you doing that? Like, I know there are a lot of judges and caseworkers here, so I really want you to like look into yourself and say, why are you doing that to people? What you're doing is inhumane. What you're doing is illogical, and what you're doing is absurd. And it has harmed me. It has harmed my children. and it has harmed how every parent that you've come into contact with. My 6-year-old who was put up for adoption to her paternal grandparents talks about suicide. I didn't even know that 6-year-olds knew about suicide. She doesn't use the word suicide. She says she wants to kill herself because she wants to be home with me. She loves her grandmother, of course, but she wants to be with her parents. She doesn't understand why this happened, and there was no reason for it to happen, no legitimate reason for it to happen at all. And I also want to note that the system is completely imbalanced and irrational in other ways as well. In my case, I think highlights this in a way that's like, I'll admit this particular aspect I think is a little bit extreme and absurd, like more than the average case, but it's highlighting a truth that is relevant to so many cases, which is that my daughter's paternal grandfather overdosed on alcohol a few months after my children were removed, severely, to the point that he lost all executive function. He still has no executive function, and they adopted my children to him. He can't consent, he can't talk, he can't walk, he has no executive function, he can't do anything, he can't speak, he could not consent to this adoption, but he's my children's adoptive father somehow. And I am not using heroin. I am not, I mean, you know, sometimes I use marijuana, like I'll admit that, but I'm not using the substance that was supposedly problematic for me anymore. So why are my children with someone who can physically not take care of them and not with me? Why were my rights terminated? Why were they put in this placement that is causing them psychological harm on a daily basis, where they only have one parent, their grandmother, to take care of them, who's also taking care of their grandfather 24/7? Why aren't they with me and their father? It doesn't make sense. It's a system that doesn't make sense, and it's a system that cuts ties forever based on a temporary situation that could be resolved if we looked at people with empathy, and if we looked at people with care, and if we stopped looking at people like they are just statistics, or just the result of a drug screen, or just that little pocket of time when you witness them at some visitation where who knows what was going on, except we do know that they are under the stress of being observed while with their children, which is extremely traumatic and uncomfortable, and just like alien and unnatural. So like judging a parent in that situation is just like ridiculous. That's not real life. That's a fictional kind of scenario that the system invented and then is using it to judge people. And I'm going to be really honest right now. I have a hard time believing that the audience here actually cares. I have a hard time believing that people in the system don't know what they're doing. I have a hard time believing that you don't know the harm that you're causing, and that you're not just perpetuating it because it generates income for your system. But if you do care, you need to change what you're doing, because all you're doing is causing irreparable harm. And I think that's all I need to say right now.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for being so honest and bold and challenging our audience. That's what we're here to do, and I appreciate it. I know, and you're getting a lot of support in the chat. We did have a question for you. From Sarah, she does ask, what do you think should have been done to help your system, or your situation, instead of your parental grandparents calling the agency? So I guess that's, goes to reporting, and that's always the concern, but what would you recommend? And if other folks have answers too, I mean, Professor Stephens or Alexandra, but if Elizabeth, if you wanted to answer that.
Yeah, so what should have been done by the system was absolutely nothing. There was no issue until the system became involved. I was in remission, as I mentioned earlier. And I had just moved to Florida, so I was on Medicaid, so I was waiting for my Washington State Medicaid to run out, because you can't have Medicaid in 2 different states at the same time. So there was a pause in my treatment, but it was like a month-long pause. And it was stressful, moving is stressful, but it was nothing that warranted that call. I think the call itself was placed because of some issues, personal family issues, and the system should never have been involved. It should never, the caseworker should have come, well, I don't think the caseworker should have come at all, but if the caseworker came, they should have come and said, you know what, there's no reason for us to be here, we're closing this case. That's what should have happened.
Okay.
The system did nothing but cause harm. I mean, you know, I did eventually relapse after I was denied care for all that time. And at that point, I was the one who sought out and found evidence-based treatment because the system was not making referrals to evidence-based treatment. So at that point, what the system could have done, what could have been, give me a referral to evidence-based treatment instead of like some ridiculous group where people just sat around like talking about drunk driving. You know, and then maybe not judged me because like it really was not something like I didn't harm my children at all at any point in time ever, and that was actually admitted on the stand. My relapse was directly related to the system intervention anyway. Not that I think substance use even is a reason to get involved with the system, but it, you know, they could have recognized that at that point, but really they just shouldn't have been involved, and then that wouldn't even have happened.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's, glad you re-emphasized that you were in remission, but your point being, what happens when you're being interviewed and being accused of harm and use, what can happen? And I think some of the things you also hit on was timelines and time limits. And I know that's close and important to Alexandra, who's going to speak next. And she is before that, I know Rachel wants to.
I just want to pop in for 1 second.
Yeah.
So I apologize. I know that several of you have used the hand up function, and I see there's another Q&A as well. If you have done that, I've tried to private message you to find out what your question is, but for some reason, I'm not able to do that. So if you could private message me or go through the Q&A, we would appreciate it. And let me pull up the Q&A right now and see. There are no more open questions. Okay. Thank you. So sorry to interrupt, Alexandra.
So Alexandra is, just briefly, is our second parent ally at Legal Services in New Jersey. And her colleague is Aisha. We're thrilled and honored to have her as part of our team. She was honored last year for Unification Day. And when she was honored and we connected and spoke, she's like, I need to do more. I want to do more. I need to make sure this never happens to any other family. And I said, we might have something for you to do. And so she joined our team this year. And I will actually, she's going to speak personally, I know, and share her narrative the way she feels appropriate. And again, I just want to note, really, the comments supporting Elizabeth and her boldness is just incredible. So thank you for those who are giving you shout outs and responding to that and letting it resonate. But let's hear from Alexandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. So yes, I'm very honored with my title. I never thought I would be here, although I always dreamed it. I went through a really horrific situation, and when I came out of it and saw the light, my only hope was to help others so that this would never happen to another family like ours, and to be the person that we needed for another family. So I'm very happy to be able to step in and be that person for my clients. So I'm a little bit easy. It's a little bit easier for me to write up my speech and read it out loud. Sorry, I'm getting used to public speaking, so bear with me. But this is freshly typed, and this is from my heart this morning. There's some really sad things, some ugly things, some really raw stuff. But I need to get this out for everybody to understand what happens on the in-between, the underneath, the behind the closed doors, the 5 years later, you know, with the kids that were removed, and all that stuff. So try not to get emotional, and I'm just going to start reading. So just bear with me. While I may not reflect the common parent that Jey represents, the misconception that a certain race, poverty, or addiction problem must mean you are a bad or incapable parent is still prevalent. I have seen firsthand how the system affects Black and Brown communities and neighborhoods simply because of race and poverty. I know that Black mothers face the biggest barriers in the system. I am here to help all parents, families, and children in the system to avoid what I went through and change the narrative. The removal rate of children is devastatingly high, most of these being completely preventable, and I am here to share with you some of my story in hopes to bring awareness of how pre-prevention work and breaking the stigma of addiction could have impacted my children's future and the well-being of our entire family. The removal of my children due to my untreated alcoholism has caused long-lasting, deep-seated fear, abandonment, and trauma issues with my eldest children and almost destroyed our family. I've had 2 DCPMP cases. The first tragically ending in the removal and ultimate adoption of my 2 eldest children to strangers, and the second case a triumphant and rare reunification. Let's start with the most common misconception, that substance abuse and alcoholism must mean that you are a bad parent. I'm here to tell you that those do not go hand in hand. In 2013, I found myself in the grips of alcoholism, something that runs in my family that I hoped would never affect me. I was in my mid-20s by that time, so I had done pretty well thus far, but it did. And even though I had a loving, supportive spouse and 2 beautiful children at home, it happened fast and I found myself arrested and incarcerated. Being ignorant to the disease itself and not having any support, a case was opened upon me with DCPMP. It was immediately destructive. They offered me no treatment, sent us to counseling at Catholic charities, my mother included, where she was honest that there was drinking in the home. They used it against us and banned my mother, the maternal grandmother, and our only support from being a supervisor or possible guardian. They used it as an aid in the removal of the children, also violating the safety plan we signed without knowledge of what it really meant. 2 hours later, the police and DCPMP were there to remove the children as my son was decorating the Christmas tree. Even though I had never harmed my children, they were never starved. They were always taken the best care of, the best schools, healthy and loved beyond measure. And boom, just like that, they were gone. And the ASPA clock started ticking. I was labeled and deemed a child abuser and unfit parent, something that will stay on my record and my name forever. I was forced out of our family home and into homelessness. All while the while, my unfailing husband was complying with every task and trying to hold the family together, his only fault being married to me. The system forced my husband to choose between me or our children, and after 12 years together, we even came to the sad idea of the resolution being divorce, if that's what it took. In the meantime, because our children were removed, we lost our TANF grant and we became homeless, lost our home. With no help, support, or resources provided, and eventually seeing myself as the problem, I fled out of state, went as far as Florida. And when we reached our ASFA, that horrible time frame they give you to prove you are the perfect parent before they take your children away forever, my husband was seen as incapable of parenting his children by himself. And because of his job and no childcare and that we lost our housing, our children were adopted out to total strangers, and we were just left on our knees in the dust of what our life was. After everything that happened, my mental health was severely affected. The soul aching pain I endured after having my children taken from me only fueled my alcoholism, and I attempted suicide. I coded 8 times and lost oxygen to my brain and ended up in coma for 3.5 weeks, even having to learn how to walk and eat normally again. By the grace of God, I pulled through and tried to make some sense of my life and my marriage moving forward. I knew that even if it took until they were 18, I was going to create a beautiful life and a mom that they could find later and be proud of. A few years later, we ended up pregnant with a new baby. How bittersweet that was. But simply for the fact we have had prior terminations, the state automatically opened a case and stepped in to take this next child from us, and did. How devastating to both mother and infant, for there is no stronger bond on this earth. This time I knew what they were ultimately capable of, and I wasn't going down without a fight. They were not going to take another baby from me. I found a wonderful women's and children's residential program, which happened to be in the same county I resided in. And in hindsight, I could have done this previously with my children had I had the knowledge of it or had it been presented to me. Also, I want to mention that this was a mommy and me program where your children can reside with you safely and monitored in a controlled recovery setting 24/7. I'd like to point out that after they took my newborn from me at the hospital, even though I was in this program, my newborn remained in stranger foster care for almost 1 whole year while I was the only childless resident, while I fought for my son and for my family's future in court. The process took forever with different evaluations. It seemed the same over and over, with the state side saying I'm a lost cause, but on the defense side and my recovery program I was in, whom was with me 24/7, said I was totally capable of being a parent and have high probability of staying sober with the right tools and support. 2 totally starkly different opinions. I wonder why. Thankfully, this time around, I had a wonderful attorney who was determined to fight as hard as I was. And after a lengthy and uphill battle, I got my baby boy reunified with me, and I was able to keep my next daughter as well. Because of the recovery and healing I received, I am now 3 years sober. And it is a beautiful thing. Recovery is possible. And sometimes we don't know what someone's recovery journey looks like. Another reason I am so passionate about abolishing ASFA. This is forever. This is our children. This is our future, and we're damaging it. I am not a lowlife. My life is worthy. I am capable. These are the things I should have been helped to see and feel, not crucified because of my addiction, because look what recovery has done for me and given to my family. I feel like had I been able to utilize prevention work, had the support of LSNJ, and had the many resources in our community presented and offered to me, the outcome of my termination would have been different, with no removal at all. The work I'm doing now as a parent ally would have had a huge impact for me had I had one. And that's why what I'm doing today, being who we needed then, to the families and children I'm fighting for now. Children don't think, when I grow up, I want to be a drug addict or alcoholic. I certainly didn't. And when I was in the grips of it, it wasn't by choice. It was a complete addiction that I alone could not stop, even though that is all I wanted to do was to stop. I feel my alcoholism made the system look down on me. They made me feel like dirt and unworthy of anything, even living. We are not all bad people. We're just hurt inside and need healing instead of escaping to a substance. I want to end my story with a happy ending. Many do not get, nor did I foresee I would have. But now I have contact and visits with my older children, and it's simply because they needed me. The adoptive parents didn't know what else to do or how to help them, and this is only because of this that we have contact. My eldest daughter is currently receiving extensive psychiatric care because of her separation and abandonment trauma, and was just committed to a facility because she is suicidal. She is 8. My son is recovering from battling with Trichotillomania, which is the pulling out of one's own hair due to a stress response to trauma. My daughter is healing and cannot get enough of us, but no matter how hard she cries or screams that she wants to live with mom and her 3 full siblings, New Jersey law prevents her from ever expressing that in court, or for me to go back to court to fight for them to return home. My husband and I, now together 18 years, live at home with 3 full siblings to our older children. How is that even fair? You can tell our children needed us. My sweet son has light in his eyes again, and full eyebrows and eyelashes and a whole head of hair. That has to say something. However, from a legal standpoint, they are still not mine, even as much as they want to come home. Too often, we don't see beyond what we think we know about the child welfare system and addiction, and it goes so much deeper and longer than that. Today, as a supported, empowered woman, I am able to fully be present and my best self for all of my children and in my work as a parent ally. Let's couple breaking the stigma and pre-prevention work. We can save many families, and maybe mine wouldn't have had the same fate. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexandra. And sharing not only your experience and what you chose to share, but to emphasize how it sounds like you went through this, like the washer and dryer being thrown around, trying to get your children back, processed, and then thrown out of the system. And I do want to open up for some Q&A, but 2 things that you've hit on and that I just want to emphasize about the humanizing and terminology. which I think all three of you have hit on and emphasized, is that how do we see families and parents who use substances or drugs, and to kind of be really careful about our language, because I think that's so significant here. So instead of saying addict or abuser or a drug addict or crack mom, you know, to be plain about it, a parent who uses substances, a parent who uses drugs, someone who's diagnosed with a disorder. I mean, that makes a big difference. It's the labeling. When you're looked to as a parent that's critical to those children, that is significant. And if you're being reduced or diminished by being called an addict, your label is 10 feet ahead of you and dictating your story, especially at court and with your caseworkers and social workers. You both hit on that, and Dr. Stephens, Professor Stephens also brought that up of, you know, really thinking what substances you are, from coffee to marijuana where it's legal. And in our preparation for this, we talked about the changes in New Jersey about marijuana now being legal. It's been, medical marijuana has been legalized for many years, but somehow that doesn't translate to our families that we serve. They're still required to stop using marijuana in order to either be kin or have their children returned. So I'm just, you know, hearing that and knowing the importance of language. I mean, this is what judges here and folks on the call may be thinking. It's like, well, isn't it true though, if you're really struggling with heroin and you're really drinking, you are dangerous to your children, right? That's the narrative, that's the movie media image. You know, what are we supposed to do? The courts are asking if we see that you're testing positive for a drug test. I know Elizabeth and Professor Stephens, you hit on that, but is there anything else you want to add to that about what can you guide judges in trying to assess use versus safety?
I mean, I think the best thing would just be to ignore use altogether. Don't order drug tests. Don't worry about substance use at all. If someone's, it's the same with like workplace drug testing as well. If someone's substance use is at a point that it's impacting their ability to parent, then that's going to be apparent in other ways without a drug test needed at all. If you need to drug test someone to see that they're using, then their use isn't really affecting anything that you should be evaluating at all. So I would really just not do drug testing anymore at all. It's also one thing I forgot to mention is that it's also can be really traumatizing depending on the form of drug testing. I was ordered to do urine tests, which are observed in the child welfare system most of the time, and I'm a sexual assault survivor. So removing my clothes or my, my bottom layer of clothing in front of a stranger was really triggering. And after a certain point, I actually, after like a triggering event happened, I couldn't do it. Like I physically couldn't do it, even though I tried. And that's an actual, I'm blanking on the name right now, but that's an actual like condition that people have where they cannot pee in front of other people. And that was like, they were just like, you're lying, like that you're lying because you're using, like that was just the reaction, even though other kinds of drug tests could have been ordered. They just like assumed that I was lying. So that's one thing, you're potentially traumatizing people. And even if they're not sexual assault survivors or somehow like traumatized or like triggered by that, it's still like humiliating and dehumanizing. Like, does anyone here want to like pee in front of other people? I mean, if that's your thing, that's fine. But like most, I think people don't want to do that, like not with strangers, so why are we ordering people to do this? Like, that's not okay. Like, and this, like, I don't like, there's some kind of cognitive dissonance where you're like dehumanizing the person that you're ordering to do this, or like you somehow see them as less than because you're like, you're a junkie. So it's okay for you to have to take your clothes off and pee in front of a stranger. I need to plug my computer in, but that was my answer, is we shouldn't be doing this to people at all. So just don't order drug tests. Don't use it as a basis. There is no basis to do that. And you're causing harm. If someone needs help with addiction and you're not, like they want that help and you're not going to punish them for it, they're going to ask for it. Like the only reason people hide it is because you're threatening them and you're taking their kids away.
Absolutely. I have Professor Stephens.
So I think there are far more reliable measures of a relationship between a parent and their child than a drug test, right? So when you're talking about like the judges and attorneys looking at what's on the paper, remember the only person whose results on the paper are the parents, right? There are other parents in that room who are using drugs in many different ways. The 5 o'clock martini that's followed by another one, because that's how someone gets through the end of the day, through the bathroom routine, the showers, or the bedtime routine. They're not being judged on that, right? They're seeing themselves as good parents, even with a martini in hand, right? And so the idea that the results on a piece of paper could tell you everything about a parent's relationship with their child is, I think that's actually not sufficient. I think you can actually have more realistic and confidential assessments of the relationship between a parent and their child. How involved is that parent in their child's life? Is this a parent who serves like functions of like, who they know exactly what's going on at school because they're involved, right? They're the ones who the teachers call, right? They know their kid's favorite toy. They know what story to read at bedtime to comfort their child. Those, I think, are more legitimate indicators of how involved and sustained involvement in a child's life than simply relying on a positive drug test, right? There are people who don't have for instance, who don't have a glass of wine until after their kid goes to sleep because they want to read that story, right? Or there are people who are able to engage with their kids and make sure their needs are met, or bring in other folks, the community, to help support them in their role as parents. That there are so many ways to think about how we support families rather than separating them. Because as we heard from both Elizabeth and Alexandra, I think we have to start thinking about the harm caused. I hear this, and Elizabeth, you said something I thought was so important. You said, it's when you talk to parents, it's a story that is unique to them, but is a story you've heard so many times before, right? And when I heard you and Alexandra speaking, I've spoke, a lot of my work is with parents of color, and I'm hearing the same stories come through again and again. And so what I see is a system that operates efficiently. It reproduces the same results in different people. And that's the way it works. It is efficient. This is not by chance. This is how it works. And so it's an expectable consequence that families leave traumatized because the system operates in a traumatizing manner. I agree with you. It's rare to find, I've interviewed one mother who with her last child received timely services. It was residential. She got to stay with her kids. I went to her home. It was chaos, as it would be with a little girl, right? She's running around, things are getting dropped, but it's happening together, right? And she's like, okay, this is a lot. And I'm like, listen, I'm used to interviewing folks with kids. It's okay. I'll help you clean up. It's not a problem. But they got to do it together. And sadly, Alexandra, what you talked about with your experience, I've heard other mothers say this. The moment where they actually believed they wouldn't get their kids back was the moment they had lost hope, right? And so for the folks who are on this call who are in the position of making these decisions, you need to keep that in mind. You may make a statement in court on a day that cuts that thread of hope. And that is a trauma to a family. Not just you're thinking, okay, this is what you're seeing on paper, but these are people, they're not paper.
Thank you. And I think you're reflecting what we're trying to get across. If the one message we're hoping is to see that each individual has vastly different experiences, the way Elizabeth described her use versus Alexandra's use and the examples that Professor Stephens just gave. But what we're running into is that the system doesn't provide helpful resources. And in fact, it diminishes your ability to actually challenge your use, if there is a concern, it's not real. You're not really, you're, as Alexandra and I were preparing this, she described, you're so committed to trying to pass drug tests and present well versus actually healing, if there needs to be healing. And then something that Elizabeth brought up in a conversation a few times with me is that children actually benefit from seeing their parents go through recovery and response, and the genetic components that are connected to children and parents that may struggle or have use issues. It benefits them to see their parents accomplish recovery. And I know, Alexandra, I don't know if you would like to speak as to that, what that's meant to you for your kids and what you feel your kids have learned from seeing you.
So yes, definitely, it's a little hard for them to still understand, because my daughter will ask, like, well, why did you sign me up for that? I said, oh, sweetheart, I didn't sign you up. They took you, like ripped you, like stole you, kidnapped you, like from my bleeding arms, like there was no, I didn't sign you up for that, or why weren't you wanted, or, why did we send you for adoption? It's hard to explain in terms that these little minds can understand. But I know that my son is very proud of me. He just turned 15, and he's here with me. He's in the living room playing with computers. But I tell him why I do what I do, so that our story and our pain and what we went through won't be in vain, and we're going to use it to help another family. So he's very proud of me. And I tell my daughter too, like I got her into therapy. The adoptive parents, they don't understand addiction or mental health whatsoever. So she, coming of my blood and bone, it runs in our family. I've been through this with my parents and, myself and everything. So I had gotten her into therapy. I got her into psychiatric care. It's like, because I knew that's what she needed. My mom tried to commit suicide at 13, so it runs in the family. She didn't tell anybody. I don't want to see that happen to my daughter. But then again, like, how would you ever know the family history? How would you ever know where she comes from or what runs in her blood? They're like, I read some report that was like, oh yeah, the drug addicted mother. I was not addicted to drugs with her. The drinking started after her. She was never born from drugs. So that's not what's wrong with her. They're trying to figure out what's wrong with her. What's wrong with her? She was taken with no explanation and thought she thinks she's ugly. She thinks she's all these awful things. She hates herself. She wants to kill herself. And it's not just, I want to kill myself. It's she's harming herself. She's doing self-harm. And there's no reason for her to hate herself. She's so loved. She's so beautiful. And I just want her to see that. But like, how in the world would these doctors know that bipolar runs in my family? That's what she needs to be on, not amphetamines. You're making her cuckoo. I'm watching a child that has addiction running in her family at 8 years old be on a narcoleptic adult's dose of Adderall. And I'm the voice that's got to fight and go, what is wrong? Why are you doing this to her? Like, look at her. She can't sit still. She's out of control. She's smearing, like she's out of control. Well, she's on stimulants. She doesn't need to be on them. Nobody has ADHD. She's not ADHD. That's like the quick answer for everybody. They put her on it, my son on it. Oh, they were adopted. They're ADHD. No, they're not. And my son's hair started growing back the week he was with us, the week we reunified. And this was after 6 years. 6 years. And my daughter was the one I thought that maybe wasn't going to be as willing or as close, or she was, all she knows is the other family. She was 2. And so if she's this traumatized from just knowing she's adopted, and why didn't her family want her? And where are they? Do they love us? Do they want me? Do they whatever? She was 2. Now she's 8, and this is what she's going through. And she was so out of control that's why the adopted mom finally, after 6 years of me texting, calling, emailing, making videos for my kids for each birthday, showing me that we still hang their ornaments on our Christmas tree. After 6 years of that and no response, she finally responds. Why? Because she can't handle her anymore. And she just doesn't know what to do with his trichotillomania. This is the result. Is this better than what it was? Because what it was I drank at work and then I, did crazy stuff. after work alone while my kids were sleeping. Still put my kids to bed. I still got up. I worked a job every day. I still went to their doctors. We only moved to PPAC because it was a blue ribbon schools. So we wanted to move there and get the TRA from there. So they'd go to blue ribbon schools. I mean, like they're born from love for me and my husband. They were always wanted children. Somebody could have stepped in, especially if I expressed, I don't want to drink. I hate this. Make it stop. I don't even know why I do this. The first thing that I should have been offered was flyers. Even if they didn't want to like show me, they could have given me pamphlets. Here's all this recovery stuff around here. Start calling, but like Elizabeth speaks of these referrals to places or waiting for beds. They didn't do any of that for me. And this was my first time ever in trouble in my life. Like it just started. You would have think that this would have been my fifth, sixth go about it. And that the kids are, in the middle of the highway with dirty diapers dragging or something like that. Like literally just take care of my alcohol. That's all they needed to do. They could have removed me and put me in rehab because that's all I needed. Rehab stands for rehabilitation. Not like, oh, that's where all the junkies go or whatever. Like people will say, oh, you went to rehab. No, I went to heal. I went to heal the hurt little child in there that never dealt with her stuff, And now that I've healed, that's all it took. One and done. One treatment, one healing, one wonderful place. And it could have been done before. And I wish it was, because then I would have many more years of just beauty and just love and family and being present and being free from alcohol, because that's all I ever wanted. I never wanted to be my dad. And the only thing about him I got was his alcoholism. Aside from that, he was an absent parent. And that's why me and my husband stayed together and tried to stay committed to fighting for our children and fighting for ourselves to create a better life. But the fact that I have no answers for her, why she can't come home, when can she come home, and now it's a war with the other one, it's hard. That's the daughter she always wanted, but it's the daughter that should have never been taken from me. And she wants me. She looked at me, she asked me, would I take a shower with her? And then she goes, oh my God, your belly button is just like mine. We have the same belly button and the same pinky toe. And then she washed my hair. Like, these are all the things I envision. And she trusts me, my daughter, enough to be naked with me, but she wears bathing suits there to shower at her adoptive home. And we went in there naked and she washed my hair and I washed hers. And she thought I was the most beautiful creature with all the stretch marks and from having all them and everything. So this just goes to show you that she knew nothing really of me, had no memory, but all she wants is me and her family, and to soak it all in and soak up all the photo albums and her baby blanket that now my new baby uses, that I've always kept, and she still sleeps with hers, that they at least let her keep. She still has her baby blanket from many years ago. So it's just, I don't even know if I want off topic, Jay, but this goes so much further than just like, oh, hey, she got a DUI and she's got kids, so let's go punish her. You know what I mean? And the same thing, like, oh, what did they think I was white and privileged because I lived in PPAC? We were on assistance, okay? Like, we're coming from the bottom up and creating our own success, me and my husband, because we both come from broken families. We've never had a home, neither of us. We want to give one to our kids one day, but doing this to families makes it impossible, because I could have died the suicide attempt. We lost our house. We were a storage unit. We lost everything. We even lost our pets. We couldn't take care of them in the car. We lost our beloved pet. We lost everything. Everything. So.
Well, I can't say how much, and I know we only have a few minutes, how much Alexandra is bringing life to the families that she's working with. I just want to note that we have close to over 340 families that have been prevented from entering the system, and Alexandra is working with them. And I note that we stress that a lot of it is poverty driven, and we are representing these families on evictions, housing assistance, but many of them actually identify substance use issues. These lives are complicated and complex and multifaceted. But when you resolve the poverty issue, and they're able to actually access meaningful resources with the helps of Alexandra's and Aisha's, And the few other parent allies that are in the chat, welcome, especially April, I saw, supporting families in a way that they can breathe, dictated by what they see fit and what they feel appropriate. They can exist together safely. And the concept of safety is not in the conversation because you've removed the poverty issue, right? And just to quickly, again, the current system fails, and I'm not going to bore us with slides, is that there's disincentives of entering proven treatment, evidence-based, as Elizabeth said, programs because of the way the current system runs. We also know that CAPTA and ASFA is counter to CDC guidelines, like the federal guidelines that Elizabeth mentioned. Mandating child welfare notification is not serving families. It's a trigger call versus actually serving them meaningfully. Black newborns are 4 times more likely to experience system failure than white newborns. We know that hospitals have been documented to have racist screening policies, and there's a default to family separation. Take the drug addicted addict out of the home, and then we'll figure it out, which is not proven and supported anywhere else, but yet it happens day in, day in, out. And as Alexandra said, please look to our website. We're going to be focusing on repealing ASFA and having alternatives to ASFA because of the failures, because the one thing that we want you all to hit on and see that these are artificial timelines that are not supported by any science or medical communities, and actually limits and narrows the lens for these families to get meaningful services, and then they're surveilled as they are by the system. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I know there was a question that you were going to address, and it was a great question. But I know it is also 3:30, and for those of you who can't stay a few extra minutes, I am going to give the second highly anticipated CLE code word, and it's donuts. DONUTS. My husband just laughed in the background. Some people like to have donuts for breakfast. Donuts. Okay, and back to you, Jey.
No, I know we have a few minutes. The question was for Elizabeth and Alexandra, and I was trying to hit on what we think defense attorneys can do to better serve parents in these cases. And I, of course, invite Professor Stephens. I'm sure you've seen examples of advocacy as well. Is there any suggestions that you would provide to defense attorneys on this call, on this webinar, that would be helpful related to substance use?
Go ahead.
Any of us answer? Oh, okay. Well, I definitely think number one is like offering or guiding to some sort of treatment, and I do realize there's the person that's like kicking and dragging, doesn't want to go, I wasn't even court ordered to treatment. I didn't know what to do with myself. I needed the community or DCP&P or whomever to step in and help me save myself. So I think the first thing to find out if there's addiction or alcohol, like Elizabeth was saying, they send you some crazy class for like drunk driving. We don't need that. We need somewhere where we can feel like it's a safe space, and that's another issue. If it's a DCP&P sent, you're not going to feel like you can go in there and just let it all out. Like, this is the pain. This is what happened to me. It's going to get documented. Oh, she's going to be triggered. She was raised. She's been through this. She's been through that. She's expressing, she's depressed over this. Well, of course I'm depressed. I have DCP&P involvement, and my kids are, in limbo here, being taken or whatever, even what I went through, how hard to get the baby back. I mean, and the drug tests. Like, I am 50-50 with you, because I would want to be held accountable for me, because I know that to drink is to die for me. I cannot control. I black out. That's what runs in my family. So just like my recovery center, we were locked down. We were with the staff all the time, but they would always do them. And do you think they had the nerve in court to play like theirs weren't good enough? So not only did I have to pee for I must be getting away with this somehow. I had to be drinking somewhere. I had to pee for my program, and DCPP also sent me for 80-hour alcohol tests while I was locked down in the program. Like, the program's tests, how they've been running this for so many years now, they weren't good enough. So that made me feel even worse. But for me, the accountability, if they know that when I'm drinking, I'm going to get in a car, then yes, I would want to make sure, like, oh, is is she really staying sober? Because I'd want someone to step in and help me. But I feel like the system wouldn't step in and help me. They would step in and go, okay, and they take everything from me that I had, or they would never, give my kids back. Like, you feel like you can't make one mistake. And I feel like the other side needs to be heard a little bit more, because the people that were around me all the time, finally, we had to call them to testify. I spent a year there. You think they know me pretty well by now, to come and testify on my behalf, to prove that I am a wonderful person and a wonderful mother, which, again, to prove. It had nothing to do with that. I'm sober, I'm not drinking. That had nothing to do with my parenting. So again, find out what is hurting inside, or what does this person need to support them in their recovery, not take more away, but give information, give resources, give a hug. Maybe, I know I need a hug. I could have used a hug, telling someone they're a bad parent and everything's awful is only going to make them feel worse and go deeper into their addiction. And if they have any kind of suicidal ideations, then, we're losing people. They don't look back 5 years. Oh, hey, what happened to that case? Well, mom died. The kids are all messed up. And, the kids are like you said, the next generation of addicts, the next generation of people that are in counseling chairs because they are damaged. They're traumatized. There's no follow-up care with these kids. And one more thing, what really bothers me today is that I see my kids suffering and there's nothing I can do about it. I have to take what she'll give me, and I'll take it because I haven't had it. But, it's hard because I can't go fight for them and go, look at me now, look at our home and look at our beautiful life. And, like they have 3 full siblings and they want to come home. There's no way in New Jersey for me to go present that to the court. And that's what I would like to change, because like, what about all the parents that this is a done deal? Kids are gone. Moving forward, yes, we have all these plans, but what about going back? Especially if it's the kid's decision. That's why I asked you about emancipation, because my son's like, I'm 15 now. And I'm like, I don't know if it's in the state, sweetie,
Thank you, Alexandra. I know we're 6 minutes, and I know Professor Stephens has to leave. Oh, yeah, and many people are beginning to log off, but I want to make sure Elizabeth and Professor Stephens has a chance to address the question or make any closing comments before we leave.
I'll ramble less this time. I just want to say that one thing that I think defense attorneys can do is like stay up to date, like actively stay up to date on substance use in general, and then on addiction and evidence-based care. I know something that comes up, and I know it comes up specifically in New Jersey and in other states, but I've spoken to people in New Jersey who've had to deal with this, is that judges sometimes have some weird prejudices against like methadone and buprenorphine for opioid addiction. And that doesn't make sense. Like they might have a prejudice against the medication itself, or they may think that they may determine the dose of the medication that a person should be on, which is not a decision a judge should be making. And because they're not a doctor and they're not treating that patient. So I think one thing that defense attorneys should need to do is educate yourself on evidence-based standards of care. I'm focusing on opioids because that was my addiction, but there, of course, all the other addictions as well have their own standards of care that are evidence-based. Educate yourself on that. Make sure that the judge or caseworker is not violating your client's right to evidence-based care. And if they are, speak up and advocate and push until that's no longer happening. Make sure your client is getting the care that they want and need. And, and also, of course, recognize that your client has autonomy. And if they do not wish to be on that kind of medication, even if it is the evidence-based care, fight for them to do what they feel is best for them. Because ultimately, everyone's substance use is different. Everyone's recovery, if they have an addiction, is different. Everyone's coping is different. I mean, some people meet the criteria technically for addiction based on like the amount they use, but they function very well. And advocate for that person, even if they're not going to go to treatment. Some people, and I've been this person, are so traumatized and unable to access or benefit from traditional medicine that for a time, or maybe even forever, for some people, for me, it was temporary. For some people, it's not. using substances that are illegal is actually more beneficial to their health. They're more functional on them than off of them. And that doesn't make them bad parents. And you need to fight for that. Even if it's unconventional, even if it's a hard uphill battle in court, you need to fight for your client. And there are resources out there that harm reduction resources, studies, of a lot of resources out there that you can educate yourself on if you haven't already, to be able to bring this into court and say, hey, this isn't just something my client is saying and doing, this is real. There's this is something that you need to listen to. There, it's backed up.
Thank you. Professor Stephens?
And there's not much more to be said. What just Alexandra and Elizabeth, beyond moved by what you shared today, and honored to be on this panel with you. And the only thing I would add is that there's a lot of science behind everything that has been said today. I know that sometimes it can be hard to access the data and to access the research, but there are platforms where this research can be, and the experts who know this stuff can be reached. One of those things is ResearchGate. Anyone can sign on, and you can search ResearchGate for things such as substance use, the spectrum of substance use. So you can read about the use through addiction spectrum, that in fact the science supports a lot of what's been said around use through addiction. It's not, use does not equal the inability to function, right? Another one is very simply Google Scholar. You can put in a number of search terms as a defense attorney to learn about the science behind a lot of what has been shared here today, to dispute some of these narratives that are existing without the evidence and the science to support it, right? I know that when we've gone to the parent representation conference, that's actually been one of the panels, was how to use research to support arguments from the defense side, because the research is out there. And I know that scholars need to do a much better job of getting research to the folks who need it. But there are these platforms where you can reach it. The only other thing I would introduce as well is, because the United States is a signatory to the UN's Human Rights Commission on the Rights of the Child, they have very specific guidelines around foster placement and child welfare. And they center the rights child to their family. I often think about it, who will tell this child the stories of who they are? And you cannot get a stranger to tell your child stories of who they are. You need family to do that. And children have a right to their family, and that's supported by the UN. So we are not just existing on our own. The US does sometimes try to exist in a vacuum, but we're not, and we signed it. So if we signed it, we should adhere to it. That's all I have to add.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just to note, all the links and with that Professor Stephens just mentioned, and the resources Elizabeth has mentioned, we'll pull together, and they'll be in the materials. Thank you, everyone. I do want to note there were comments saying that there are supportive adoptive parents, and we understand that. That's not, there's well-meaning, wonderful parents, of course. I think what the stories we wanted to highlight and share, Alexandra's story and Elizabeth's story and reporting, is that for these children, it's still significant to have these relationships with their parents, even though they were legally terminated. It's like a legal fiction for these children. And so we have to think past those structures, even if there's well-meaning children. So I do want to note that we understand that. And Alexandra has shared in her own story, she's grateful to the stranger adoptive parents reaching out to her in the first place. So that was part of her story as well. So I do want to stress that. Again, thank you for this incredible presentation, conversation, your vulnerability and honesty. I hope people will take away some thoughts about challenging the system, really the narrative, believing that substance use is not a sole reason or bar to terminate rights or stop parenting. So that's really what we hope you take away today.